Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Oakley, managing partner here at Oxbow, and we have a really special guest today. A little bit different take, but I think you're going to really like it. It's Dr. Gio Valiante, who is an unquestionable one of the best performance coaches, writers. Wrote a book called Fearless Golf. He's helped many golfers through many PGA tournaments. He helped Urban Meyer to help those Florida Gators get the national championship. John McDermott, Buffalo Bills. Dr. Gio, you've about done it all. Then you went over into the investment world.
Yeah, that was there's that old saying that God, man makes plans and God laughs, right? And in that spirit, I'll never forget it. In fact, this Monday it came up on my calendar as the anniversary. So I was out at the U.S. Open at Chambers Bay out in Seattle, and sports psychologist to a bunch of PGA Tour golfers. And for the first time in my life, I was losing. I didn't want to be at a golf tournament for the first time in my life. It was because I started having kids and I was away from my children and I don't want to be on the road anymore. And I was like, geez, I've never not wanted to be at a PGA Tour event. It's my passion. It's my love of my life. And like, what do I do with this moment? And, in almost a divine sense, the next week I got an email from Steve Cohen's chief of staff. And they said, hey, listen, we've heard about all the results you're getting in golf. Would you be willing to come give a talk at Point 72? And I said, sure. And so I went and gave a talk to the investment, to all the PMs and Steve and everyone. What I did not know is that they were looking to hire for an in-house performance coach. They'd interviewed 38 people for the job. So I went and I gave the talk. And that night they said, what do you think? I said, what do I think about what? And they said, well, can you help us? I was like, I don't know anything about you guys. I'm just here to give a talk. Anyway, they offered me a job, and I said, I got to tell you, the last 15 years, the answer would have been a categorical no, because I was a full professor at Rollins College, and I loved being a professor, and I had great stable players on the PGA Tour, but I had a sabbatical coming up, and I didn't really want to travel golf anymore. So I said, let's give it a shot. And that was 10 years ago, I think about 10 years ago now, and I've been working in the world of finance ever since. But how it happened is just it was a real turning point in my life, but a blessing in retrospect.
So let me ask you a couple of questions along that line. How would you correlate the world of sports performance and what the average investor would do relative? Do you correlate that, what the average investor has to go through, with what happens in sports performance?
100%. No. That's the most remarkable thing that I've discovered is the psychological playbook that worked on the PGA Tour to the tune of 50 wins, right? So when I work with golfers, I never give a golf lesson, right? I've generated 50 wins. I want you to really actually think about the power of psychology for a minute. When golfers call me, I'm typically the last phone call, right? It's after they fired their caddy and fired their swing coach, and their dog doesn't even want to be around them, right? They're just, I get the worst of the worst. They're in a slump and they've been playing bad for a long time. And by changing mindsets or how people think about the game, we've been able to sort of generate 50 wins. And that's not a pat on the back to me. I stand on the shoulders of giants. But it speaks to the power of really good psychology, that if you change mindset the right way, you can actually change an empirical scoreboard. It's true to standardized testing in schools. If you get kids thinking the right way about testing, you can actually change. Standardized tests are supposed to be objective and measure some, quantifiable number, but it's quantifiable, but it's also variable. And I say all that because the psychological playbook that I ran on the PGA Tour when I started getting into finance, I worked really, really, really hard to pay close attention and bring the same type of rigor into finance that I did as an academic. And the parallels are abundant. And I'll give an example of just one of them. Actually, I'll give two of them. One of them is this. So the human brain craves predictability and control, right? Predictability and control. We like to know what tomorrow's going to bring. And when you have, when the outcomes of your life are governed by some version of variability, things over which you have no control, right? There's mathematically, there's constants and there's variables. So, for example, on the PGA Tour, you can play perfectly and shoot a bad score. You could do nothing wrong and miss a cut. And that could happen for long periods of time, like the law of large numbers, right? Randomness. So like the law of large numbers, you can, you put a random number generator and you flip a quarter 5 million times. What you're going to see in that set of 5 million flips is you're going to see 100 heads in a row. You're going to see 100 tails in a row. You'll see heads, tails, heads, tails. You'll see all sorts of patterns. And at the end of it, it's going to be 50-50. But the path to 50-50 has all sorts of randomness. And that's true in any game where there's variability, like golf. Well, it's the same with investing, right? Every investor, every professional investor talks about having a process. And there's this interesting dance that happens between, process and results. And there's often a lag effect where you're doing the work on the front end, you're not getting returns, or gosh, you could be even losing money. And the question at that point is, are you going to commit to your process and stick to it, or are you going to abandon it and capitulate? And so what happens is when people are attached to the variability of short-term outcomes, their psychological profile tends to look like the P&L. And so one of the things that I had to do in golf that I often do with investors is we talk about having a healthy detachment from short-term results. Because if you are attached to short-term results, your psychological profile is going to look just like those results. And essentially, it's going to look like your P&L. Like you're making money, you're happy, you're losing money, you're sad. And it's this anxiety that often compromises decision-making, well, always compromises decision-making. So the parallels between particularly golf, not, all sports have a certain component of that, but golf is the most closely aligned with investing. And it's largely because the scoreboard, P&L or score, is not directly under your control. There's a lot of variability in results.
Well, on that question, if this is your book and you spend a lot of time in the beginning talking about fear being the enemy. And I want to give you these two pieces of fear that investors have. For example, right now, they have a fear on the upside. They're thinking, hey, it's running away from me. I should have been in it. And so they're shifting mental capacity that direction. You get a market move downward, 25, 35, 45%. And then that fear goes the other way. It goes into, gosh, I'm afraid I'll lose it all twice as much as the other one. But those fears probably show up in the sports world too. I mean,
so on that note, Ted, or on that point, what's interesting about Fearless Golf, which is the first book I wrote. So Fearless Golf, I had written for an audience of about 300 people, and I had to battle with the publisher because they wanted it to be a book written for a broader audience because it would sell more, and I wouldn't compromise. So I wrote it for just very sophisticated, high functioning golfers, essentially people on the PGA Tour, and so. That book was supposed to sell maybe 1,000 copies. And it ended up being published in 7 different languages. Wow. And it shocked all of us. And in retrospect, I wonder why. Like, what is it about Fearless Golf that struck such a nerve or common sense chord with so many people? And it's exactly what you said. It's this idea of fear, because fear, it's the universality of the human condition. In other words, except for very, very, small portion of situations, brain damage or something like that, everyone has the circuitry to be afraid. And people say that the markets are driven by fear and greed, but they're driven more by fear than greed. And the reason is fear is other than grief, like grieving, grieving the loss of a loved one, fear is the most powerful emotion. It governs so much of what people do. Now, here's I think sort of the setup and sort of the way the equation works. So everyone's hardwired for fear. And it's largely irrational because as I was doing my research and my initial studies that led to Fearless Golf, I was interviewing some of the best golfers in the world. And it was a structured interview, 13 of the same questions in a row to everybody. And the idea of fear kept coming up. And I was puzzled. I'm like, well, this isn't boxing. It's not like you're going to get punched by Mike Tyson. It's not the NFL. You're not going to get tackled by Lawrence Taylor. you're playing golf for a living. Why is everyone talking about fear? And what's the root of this fear? And you start to realize that fear is rooted in all these little different places. But the problem is independent of the cause of people's fear, because everyone's walking around with some level of fear and anxiety about various things. Fear distorts our ability to see things accurately. So therein lies the problem with the downside of fear. Because the way the brain evolved, think of it this way. If you're fearful, you survive, right? And as sort of natural selection happens and humans are trying to make their way in the world. So it keeps you alive. But like the brain did not evolve for you to be a professional investor. The brain did not evolve for someone to be a professional golfer. Just it evolved to keep you alive. And so it's a really imperfect instrument. It's a remarkable instrument. The brain's an incredible mechanism for learning and all these things that it does, but it's really imperfect. And so what happens is the fear mechanism is such a powerful feature within the brain, like the circuitry. It's called the amygdala, the sort of middle part of the brain. There's twice as much dedicated circuitry going from the emotional part of the brain into the cognitive part than the other way. The idea being what Henry David Thoreau said, like the heart has reasons the head will never understand. But translating that is our emotional lives are far more powerful than our rational lives. Now, whether we feel it that way or experience it that way, it doesn't really matter because it's just true. And every cognitive psychologist and neuroscientist, like there's proof ad infinitum that this is a fact. So everyone walking around thinking they're rational actors, you're not. You're not. I'm not. Nobody is. Mr. Spock was, but like that's it. But we don't experience it that way. So the idea being, fear exists. Sometimes we feel it, a lot of times we don't, but at the end of the day, it distorts our ability to see things accurately. So I'll give a quick example. What happens in golf, I'll do a quick story. So Tiger Woods, I was on the driving range with Tiger Woods at Isleworth Country Club back in like 2000 and I don't know, 8, 9, 10, something like that. And he was having trouble with the driver. And I said, what happens? He goes, well, I stand on the tee, I look down the fairway, and the fairway goes, doo, 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 and he goes, and it looks about that wide. So think, the greatest golfer in the history of the game, this fearless golfer, even he starts to feel fear, and it distorts what he sees. Right? In golf, we have a saying, the confident golfer sees the green next to the lake, whereas the underconfident golfer sees the lake next to the green. In other words, fear distorts what we see. Now, how does this happen? What happens in the investing world? Well, two things. Number one, when you're making money, it feels like you never lose money again. When you're losing money, it feels like you'll never make money again. And all these perceptual shifts that happen. But what happens is the confident investor, in looking out at the market, sees the market as a place of abundance. He or she sees the market as a place of opportunity. The confidence in their conviction, in their beliefs, sort of leads to all sorts of behaviors that ends up making money. When we lose our confidence, in other words, when our mindset starts getting imbued with fear, rather than seeing the marketplace as a place of abundance, we see it as a place of threat. We see nothing but danger. And so how that manifests itself is, number one, we don't see opportunities accurately, right? Number two, we tend to overtrade. In other words, because we're so driven by fear, any little threat to our P&L, and we start getting out of trades, start over-trading, getting out of positions. We abandon our process, right? We don't know a good idea if it hits us in the face because all we see is the danger that's built into everything. So having a mechanism for thinking about and dealing with and really protecting yourself from fear, I think is of the utmost importance.
Could I quote your book, if I could, where you said, fear begins and gets its fuel from the uncertainty of self-questioning. That's a great line, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. No, it's but again, I stand on the shoulders of giants. Everything in that book was what I drew out of sort of the people that I was interviewing who were sharing their experiences with me. So when we think about confidence and fear, they do this, right? So the more confident we get, the less fear we feel. And the more we lose our confidence, the more fear we feel.
Up and down markets.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And like and this is one of those markets, interestingly enough, to your point, the fear tends to be on the right side of the distribution, but like it's fear nonetheless. And that's the other thing. Fear doesn't care what causes it. Fear just is. Like the fear that a person feels, if a wolf is snarling at them, is the same fear that we feel standing over a 3-foot putt, is the same fear that we feel losing money. Like fear just is. It doesn't, the way the brain processes things, it doesn't immediately decipher what's the cause of the fear. You just feel it, which is why, I think it was E. E. Cummings who wrote, he wrote a poem says, or T.S. Eliot is kind of, since feeling is first, whoever pays any attention to the syntax of things. But that opening line, since feeling is first, these poets are wonderfully insightful to the human condition, but like we feel before we think. And so all of our visceral reactions are the things that largely govern, decision making. In fact, there's an acronym for it called ECDBR. So it's emotion. So here's how the brain works. And think of this in the world of investing. We feel something, emotion. Then cognition, we have a thought. D, we make a decision. B, we behave. In other words, we take action on that decision. And then R, which is rationalization, right? Which is we explain the reasons why we did what we did, right?
Right.
So the direction, the order, the way the brain sort of functions, generally speaking, is emotion, then cognition, we think, then decision, we make, I'm going to do this now. Then we behave, we pull the trigger, we invest our money, we deploy our capital. Then R, we rationalize why we did what we did. But what people don't understand is the explanation for our behavior is generally tethered to the decision we made. Yeah. People don't go far enough back into sort of understanding the actual driver of their behavior.
On that note, I was going to ask you, and I watched a lot of you talked about this subject, but we work with a lot of people, always have for many or 4 decades, really, people that sell companies. And obviously that's a really big liquidity event. It can be many hundreds of millions in many cases. But you mentioned on attachments that after the fact, when people have capital, that one of the lines you use is that you should deploy capital proportionally to the opportunity, because what we see is a lot of people over deploy into things. They don't know what they're doing, so they over deploy capital in the investment side. You see that?
Yeah, no, one of the things that we're constantly trying to do at this point in the evolution of human history is to just essentially effectively compensate for the flaws of the human brain, right? Because as I articulated earlier, the brain did not evolve for someone to be an investor, like just to keep you alive, right? So we're working with a really imperfect instrument in the human brain. So what we want to do is, how do we compensate for the irrationality and sort of the cognitive biases and defense mechanisms and the ego and all the things that sort of distort decision making. So in golf, one of the clarifying things that I think I contributed to the game it's generally on the record is a golfer. Who's your competition? I would ask golfers. Who are you competing against? Because they're all competitive people. Oh, I'm competing against other players, or the leaderboard, or the field, or my past self, or all these things that come up. But the reality is, you should always be just competing against the golf course, right? One shot at a time. Golf played the right way is more of a dart game than a horse race. I would always tell this to golfers, you're not playing against other golfers. It's just you and the golf course. And so the fundamental question in golf is simple. It's what's my target? And if a golfer does nothing else but constantly repeats, what's my target? That kicks out 80% of the biases, right? If you just clarify that it's a dart game. The equivalent to that for investors is exactly what you just said, Ted. It's you should deploy capital. If you want the exact phrase, it's deploy capital exactly proportional to the opportunity in the market in the moment. Because if you just audit your decision making against that, because it begs the question, why do people deploy capital? Well, they're losing money and they want to make it back quickly, or they start imposing their needs on the market, or they've built a lifestyle that's so expensive that they need to make money to keep, like the level of rationality, even for smart, or especially for smart people. So if you're trying to question whether this is a good investment, you should ask yourself, does this investment stand up to this standard? Am I deploying this capital proportional to the opportunity in the market, not how much money I need to make, not because my manager's telling me I need to generate 10% or 15% or my investor base, I've got to make more money than, the yield that's giving in bonds and currencies. It's like, no. Those are irrational reasons to deploy capital. Fundamentally rational thinking is you're deploying capital proportional to the opportunity as you see it in the moment. And I think if you just hold that as the standard, at the very least, you're not prone to sort of the biases that are implicit in the human condition.
And it's interesting, Dr. Gio, one of the things we see with people with enormous wealth really is that they have their own biases, number one, and number two, they have outside influences, people or whatever, that drives them, and they forget. And we always try to get people to remember this. What's the point of investing? Well, the true point of investing long term is to maintain buying power. I mean, if you stay up with the world, 50 years from now, you'll be doing the same things you're doing today. And they forget about that, and they forget about the consistency part of that. And you talk a lot about consistency, and I know you used Tiger Woods as that. And consistency in the investment world is really important. I have to tell you the stories because you wrote about consistency. You see this right here?
I love it.
40 years ago, a guy that we were in a bear market, and I was not doing a very good job. And the president of a big hamburger chain fired me. And he said, "Hey, I just want to tell you something. All 500, 600 outlets I have, every manager has that on their desk, and now you'll have it on your desk. Because if you don't have consistency in your investment world or any other world, you're gonna, it's at that line you showed, the straight line and then the variable line." And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about consistency, because I know you talk so much about how Tiger Woods was so consistent.
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly good point. And in performance psychology, that's where we've arrived. It's in golf we call it routines, and investing we call it a process. And so, but I want to make it. I want to validate that point, but I'm going to also say I'm going to critique it and then validate it. So in every investment firm, in every interview, every manager's asking investors, "What's your process?" Right? And in the golf world, the same thing. And I sometimes ask people, so what's the value of process? What's the value of consistency? We're like, why? Why does it matter? Because alcoholics have a process, right? They drink every day. Drug addicts have a process. So process all by itself, or consistency all by itself, is not the solve. Now, with that caveat, what I'm going to say is you have to have a process that you run consistently, because without it, you have no shot, because then you're just reactive to everything. And so if you think about changing human behavior, which is a very difficult thing to do, it's very hard. Karl Marx one time observed, he said, "Give me a child to the age of 7 and I'll give you a communist for life." And what he was speaking to is how once these formative years are over and a person's sort of personality is baked into the cake, it's really hard to change people. And that's what the business I'm in is. I have to change people's behaviors to get better results, right? So more than most, I know how hard it is to change a behavior. Now, one of the sort of tools that I use, or one of the understandings that I think part of the reason I've been able to get some results is I come in with the assumption that changing behavior is really, 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 really hard. And changing someone's mind on anything is really, really, really hard. And especially if they're wealthy and successful, because what happens is with rich people is the mental math they do is some version of, "I'm rich, so every decision I make must be right." They're convinced that they're always right because
you've got the most true statement that we've ever run into where people come into immediate liquid wealth. That's it.
Yeah. It's like, hey, I'm smarter than everyone else, and the results prove it. The ends justify the means, right? So it's some version of they think they're right about everything. So it's really incredible. Until life humbles them, at which point they finally get vulnerable enough and humble enough to open themselves up to listening. But anyway, it's neither here nor there. So one of the key things that matters in helping people is to say, see, I'm not going to be able to change 500 things about a person. but I can change one thing. If I can change one thing, repeat it, right? So changing human behaviors, if I can get you to change one thing and then we repeat that every day, at the end of the year, it's 365 changes. It's one thing 365 times instead of 365 things. And so a lot of the success that my clients have had is like we say, okay, you start with this. What's actually reasonable? Like what can we do? I don't want to, people say, I'm going to get a cold plunge. I'm going to do a cold plunge every day at 5 a.m. It's like, no, you're not. Like, there's no chance. So let's not get over ambitious. Let's start small. And if we could tweak one thing in what you're doing and get some consistency with that one change, we can start stacking after that. In fact, there's this wonderful article. It's online for anyone to find. It's called The Mundanity of Excellence. And it's a profile on exceptional swimmers. But essentially, it converges on the point that when you're trying to move people out into the tail end of the distribution, you're not making big changes. You're making small changes repeated over time. And you start to love the mundanity, the mundane things, the everydayness of investing and of your job. And so finding the thing that you can change, and oftentimes just try to make it stick. I'll show up, I'll be working with a golfer, for example, a PGA Tour golfer. And it'll be like, okay, I'm falling behind in the tournament, Doc. What do I do? Run the routine, what I call the fearless golf routine. Run your routine. I'm leading. I've got the 54-hole lead. I'm nervous. Tomorrow's Sunday, and I'm paired with Jordan Spieth. What do I do? Do your routine. Just like the world changes, but you don't. And so every once in a while, I'll hand them a shampoo bottle. What's this? You trying to get me to change my shampoo? And I say, no, read the back of it. Lather, wash, rinse, repeat. Like that's what you do. Whether you're leading, whether you're trailing, whether you're getting good luck, or all the variability around you, because we want to hold constant as many things as we can. And the routine and the processes that we put in place. Heck, this is what Sean McDermott, when he went, listen, the Buffalo Bills were in a 17-year playoff drought. Sean McDermott showed up as a first-time head coach. He started making T-shirts for him. Trust the process. Everyone's all over the building. Trust the process. In other words, stop thinking about wins and losses. Stop thinking about short-term results. We're going to implement a process. And then the Buffalo Bills have made the playoffs for 6 years in a row under his leadership. Why? Because he's religious about process.
Yeah. And people forget, it's interesting because you get in different kinds of markets. And you mentioned earlier, attached to short-term results. And I think one of the most dangerous things for the average investor, and we do hear this from time to time, is, hey, this person over here is doing a higher number than I am. And of course, we always say, well, wait a minute, you're maybe comparing apples and oranges, but what is your goal with investing? What's your goal? What are you trying to do? And they always forget about that. And all of a sudden it comes in, and you're talking about the attachment of the results. And we see that a lot in the business. And the other thing I was going to say is that you had a great line in one of your speeches that said, let go of the things that don't matter and your life will be better. And I think people sometimes, and maybe you can elaborate on that, but people sometimes on the investment side, they hold on to things that probably don't matter on the long run, but they're all hung up in the short run.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you that observation, that insight, if I were to attribute the success that some of the golfers I've worked with had, I'd say it's directly connected to this idea of attachments, right? So let me sort of set the stage for that a little bit. So here's what is known, is that in the world of high performance at the tail end of the distribution, and it's domain agnostic, whether it's investing, tennis, or golf, arts and crafts, or really whatever your calling is in life, being a writer, being an academic, being a scientist. One of the things that is very true is you need what's called psychological freedom, right? Unencumbered by fear, and because if you're free psychologically, you can see things with action. You have the courage of the conviction of your vision, right? Of what you're trying to do. And William James, this isn't me, this is William James who wrote about this. Now, what happens is freedom and attachment cannot coexist at the same time. So think of it this way. if I'm attached, this is me, and let's say this is, my P&L, my returns, and I'm attached to them. As they go, I go with them, right?
Hmm.
In golf, if I'm attached to my score, or even better example, if you and I are playing golf together and through 3 holes, you're 2 under par and I'm 2 over par and you're beating me, and I'm attached to what you're doing, I have no control over what you're doing, but I'm attached psychologically to what you're doing. As you go, I'm going along for the ride with you. I have no freedom because freedom and attachment cannot coexist, right? So in order to be psychologically free, you have to detach. So what are the things that, we talk about living in a psychological straitjacket, where most people live in a psychological, and Henry David Thoreau wrote about that, right? He said, man is born free, but everywhere he lives in chains. Well, he meant that psychological, metaphorically, obviously. So what did he mean by that? So here are the attachments that tend to undermine great decision making. Number one is people are attached to other people's opinions of them. Everywhere, every day, people are running around terrified that they're going to be judged by other people. What does that person think of me? Oh my God, I want them to love me. I crave approval. And like they live with this ever-present fear that people don't like them, or they're not good enough, and it's the craziest thing because number one, you can't control what people think of you. Number two, people don't give that much time or thought or effort into like forming an opinion. They're very sort of careless with forming views. So you cannot go through life caring too much, particularly if you're a famous athlete and you're in the spotlight. But that's true of everybody. So number one, we're attached to people's opinions of us, and there's real danger in that because you'll live your life seeking approval rather than chasing excellence relative to the craft itself, right? The terror, we call the tyranny, the terror of being judged by others. The second thing people are attached to is their net worth, right? The number. What's your
Oh,
number?
as big as anything in the world.
Right. And as the number goes up, you go along with it. And as the number, like, so now that's an attachment, right? So all of a sudden, you're going along with the thing you're attached to. So if you feel that people are liking you, you're happy. People are criticizing you, you're sad. If your number's going up, you're happy. If it's going down, you're sad. We attach to the past. We attach to the past. We attach to things that have already happened. It's a really remarkable thing. I had this client once, wonderful, lovely human being. Oh, what a guy. And at 50 years old, he had accumulated, he had grew up poor, poorish. And at 50 years old, he had accumulated $500 million, but he'd earned it. It wasn't in a liquidation event. It was year after year working on making a lot of money. But he wasn't happy. He's 50 years old, 2 kids, great wife, great life. The veneers of his life were great, but he wasn't happy. Woke up at 4 a.m. every day, worked maniacally to make more money, but always had, Freud said that the eyes are the window to the soul. And you could really see it in this guy. Just his eyes were always just never really, really happy. One time, one of our sessions, we started to talk about it and dive a little deeper. And as it turns out, when he was 19 years old, he was dating a girl, if I remember correctly, her name was Sandy. And she was from the It family in town. And he wasn't, he had nothing. And he had a dysfunctional brother and child of divorce. And, at some point in the relationship, she broke up with him. And he was confused. He thought the relationship was going well. And as he dug in a little deeper, it's like, why? At the end of the day, it's like, hey, you don't belong in our world. My family's not signing off on this. My mom drove a white Jaguar, which in the 80s was like the thing to drive. White Jaguar. I'm just sort of recalling the conversation we had. And what happened was in his brain, essentially what he said to himself is like, no one's ever going to break up with me again because I'm too poor. The problem is at 50 years old and $500 million, like you've solved that problem, number one. Number two, you've moved on in life on some level, but you have never let go of the past. You haven't detached. You're still attached to that moment, and you're working to make that pain go away. And so in all 3 cases, whether it's P&L, whether it's other people's opinions of us, whether it's the past that we're attached to, what we all have to do at that point is recognize what our attachments are and then let go. You have to detach from the things. Anything that's in your mind that's governing your thoughts that you didn't put there intentionally is likely an attachment. So the degree to which you can let go of the past, let go of your attachment to short-term wealth, let go of your of caring about what other people think about you. When you detach from these things, what fills in that space is the kind of freedom we're talking about.
I was going to tell you a funny story, but you'll appreciate this too. Uh, in a speech Nick Saban gave, he was back in his hometown, and he was Miss Terry. He was driving by a gas station, and her old boyfriend in high school was running, and he said, "See, if you're married to him, that's what you'd be doing right now." And she said, "No, if I were married to him right now, he'd be the head football coach at the University of Alabama."
I love that. That's a great story. That's a great story. I love strong women. I love smart women, and when they can hold their own against someone like Nick Saban.
So I'm going to switch subjects with you because I've heard you speak some about this. I think it's really one of the things I mentioned is that one of the biggest things people have with wealth, particularly first generation wealth, they have a lot of it with children. And you mentioned, and you relate it to golf really, about handling wealthy children and the difference between those, why they're not necessarily, top of the leaderboard. And so you might talk about that a little bit. You have a great insight to wealth and children and how that should be impacted, but it's not.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when we look at the American Psychological Association, there's about 50 different divisions, and probably, in my opinion, the best division is the field of educational psychology. Educational psychology is in advance of sports psychology. Sports psychology is like in advance of behavioral economics. Like not all divisions are created equal. So some of the best work comes out of educational psychology. And the field of educational psychology really studies what's known as developmental psychology. What happens in the life cycle, cradle to the grave? What does a life look like? The various stages of life, and sort of some of the insights about healthy child development are really antithetical, antagonistic to raising kids in privilege. I was a professor at Rollins College for 15 years. It's a great liberal arts college down in Winter Park, Florida. But it also tends to sort of cater to a lot of wealthy families. It's a very expensive college to go. There's a lot of scholarship money too, so it's not only wealth, but like a lot of the kids are heirs and heiresses and children of privilege, and they'd come in and would talk to me after class, and we'd have a lot of you do what professors do is you sort of chat with your students, try to help them through a transitional time in life. But I was just shocked at how much sadness there was imbued with kids of privilege because you'd never expect it, right? And what ends up happening oftentimes is if I'm a child of wealth and privilege and family vacations, we're traveling, and everywhere we're staying at the Four Seasons every week. Well, that becomes normal to me. Like I've normalized the Four Seasons. So it begs the question later in life, where do I go from there? Like, what's the next step up? Like, how far out on the curve are you going? And so essentially, this is a harsh thing to say, but it's really true. As a parent, when you're raising kids with that much privilege, you're robbing them of the ability to do it for themselves. It's disrespectful. The most fundamental thing to a happy, functional, healthy adulthood is the development of some level of self-reliance, the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and that you've learned, I can rely on myself. I did it. I did a hard thing. I solved a hard problem. I achieved something for myself. Abraham Maslow, writes about this. He writes sort of this overparenting, which is just it's more common now than at any point in human history, as an overprotection. And by overprotecting kids, you're making them fragile. And if you make them fragile, they have no mechanisms to deal with the adversity of life, which is going to come. Yeah. And so one of the things, it's sort of one of the paradoxes of wealth. Like, I lived at least 10 standard deviations below my means.
And I always have. And it's not because I'm scared. It's because I really think that blue collar values are the only way to go through life. Like I love abundance and I don't vilify wealth. I want all my clients to make as much money as you can. But in designing a functional, healthy life for yourself and your children, there has to be a component of difficulty. There has to be accountability. There has to be accurate, intellectual honesty, accuracy. There has to be struggle. And all these parents who say, you know what, I'm protecting my children from struggle because I love them, it's a lie. That's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because you yourself are fragile, or you yourself don't want to do the hard work of parenting, which is watching your kids struggle, learn how to fail the right way, and then ultimately succeed. You're not doing them any favors. And the other reason parents overparent, largely, it's not about the children, it's about them. It's, I don't want to be viewed as a bad parent to all the people in the club or at the private school. So it's like you're overparenting your kids to protect your own vanity. And it's just, it's disrespectful. And so what I would teach my students at Rollins College, I would say, listen, anyone in life who tells you that they're making it easy for you because they care, are lying to you. As Nick Saban says, right? It takes what it takes. Like to live at the tail end of the distribution and be really good at anything, it takes what it takes. And like no one can protect you from that. If you want to be good at something, you have to put in the work, period. That's a declarative statement. It's not a question. It's not an interrogative. It's a declarative. It takes what it takes. And so, for people who have these liquidation events and come into all this money, you better be really mindful of how you're communicating to your children what that money means, whether it's their money or your money, and how you're going to get them through life and protect them so that they can be functional adults with a healthy sense of themselves.
That's probably the best description. And we've always espoused exactly what you're talking about how you have to let your children fail. And it's hard to do. But if you don't do it, they don't learn anything. And we have so many people. One of the standard lines, because there's a lot of people that get first generation wealth, they were poor themselves. And they're always like, well, I don't want my children to go through what I did. And I'm always like, yeah, you do too. Actually, you really do.
Yes.
But they won't do it. And then the other thing they always ask us is, after the spouses die, I'm worried about my children hating each other because one wants more money than the other one, whatever.
Oh,
well, that's up to you.
nightmare.
You've got to fix that, while you're here. And so I would ask you this. You have seen some, I'm assuming, because you were at this high level, really people make a lot of money. You have seen some parents that have been able to correctly do that. I'm asking a question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, parents who do it the right way. So, you've heard of the old saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations,
Yeah,
right?
Malcolm Forbes.
Yeah. It's first generation makes it, second generation grows it, third generation blows it, right? Because they grow up just learning how to spend money. Like that's what their skill is, right?
And you make a point, we should make this point where we close here, about golfers who, you talk about children being golf, you're good in high school, good in college, and then talk about that. And then you get into the pros and the difference spread between privilege and non-privilege, I should say, because you have a great story about that.
Well, I don't know what story you're referring to.
Well, you were talking about the fact that I can't remember his Judd. I can't remember his last word. You were talking about the fact that, hey, you get up. This guy, if he lost, he was going to be back in the truck.
That's right. Yeah, no, one of my favorite golfers of all time, one of the loveliest human beings I've ever met, is a guy named Chad Campbell. Played on 3 Ryder Cup teams. Very under the radar golfer, but like so good. He's a guy. Tiger Woods, Tiger Woods said, "Hey, have you guys ever seen this kid Chad Campbell hit a golf ball?" And like Chad Campbell's just this kid from West Texas, taught himself the game, went to community college, and played on the Hooters tour for I think 8 years before he ever made it to the PGA Tour. But there were times where, and it's almost like a country song. He's from West Texas, a guy named Chad Campbell. His caddy was named Judd Burkett. And they would just travel on the mini tours trying to make a living, almost like Tin Cup, right? But if you think about and I had two clients. Chad was a client of mine, and this other kid was a kid of privilege. And if each of them has a 5-foot putt to make money, if Chad doesn't make that putt, he's sleeping in his truck. Like he and Judd, there's no money. There's no money at home. Like you don't have a hotel. So he's pretty motivated to concentrate on that putt. Where this other golfer who maybe grew up at like Isleworth Country Club, hitting perfectly, new Titleists every week, perfect instruction, hitting off of perfect grass, standing over a 5-foot putt. If he doesn't make it, he's still staying at the Four Seasons. And so what happens in the brain is these things called primal cues, which are the mechanisms in the brain that heighten focus, that let us perform at our very best level. And so, I listen, even with my own children, when I don't give them what they want, which is a lot, and they're arguing with me like, Daddy, why? I'm like, it's because I love you. Oh, you don't love me. You're a terrible dad. I know. But my answer is always, I'm not getting this for you. It's because I love you. And, you are going to better life. It's because I love you. And I don't care if all your friends are going to Costa Rica for spring break. You're not going to Costa Rica for spring break. Can Dad afford it? Yeah, and I'm still not paying for it.
Well, listen, with that, I knew that story was in there, and I saw you speaking about it one time, and I'll tell you, this has been a great thing for us and everybody that's watching. I'll tell you, your insights are incredible. I know you have a new book coming out eventually that I think is going to be fabulous, by the way. And you'll see Dr. Gio's website here. He's, be a great speaker, and I'd love for any of you out there that want to use his services. He's an incredible guy, by the way. And Dr. Gio, I want to thank you for being with us for sure. If we can ever do anything for you on this end, please let us know. So we appreciate you being with us today.
You're too kind, Ted. Thank you. Thank you for those kind words. Thanks for the opportunity to spend some time with you. I wish you well for the rest of 2023, and let's hopefully connect again soon.
All right, will do. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello, everyone. I just want to say, if you like this video and you want to see more of this type of information, because we really try to get the information that you don't see from anybody else, then be sure and click on subscribe, and you'll see more of what we do here at Oxbow.